miss those who will miss the beginning will be able to see what we are and listen to us, because the proceedings of tonight will be uploaded in our web page in the relative article. So this is a feature that we want to keep. As a start, first I will introduce myself. I'm Konstantinos Mazarakis, the General Director of the Ecaterini Lascaridis Foundation. We are very happy to have Dr. Sam Geall with us. I will just make a short introduction in our subject. I am not a sinologist, so I will be a bit generic in what I say, so just bear with me. We are all used to listen to all major nations talk about the need to do something in order to avert possible environmental dangers that seem to threaten as humanity exploits the Earth's natural resources in an unviable way. Until recently, we used to think that climate change as a threat lies far into the future. This perception has clearly changed today. However, governments need to balance the very real dangers to humanity against national interests, among which, of course, national economy and growth play a major role. The Chinese government is no different than the rest of us. The government has set out ambitious targets on addressing climate change, and ecological civilization has become an important slogan for President Xi Jinping. China has demonstrated a remarkable energy transformation in its domestic market, but the country, just like other nations around the world, is finding it difficult to move away from coal-fired power. So Dr. Sam Geall, CEO of China Dialogue and Associate Fellow at Chatham House and Associate Faculty at the University of Sussex, will present us with his views on the subject. Dr. Kωνσταντίνος Τσιμώνης, lecturer in Chinese sociology at King's College Lau China Institute, London, will give a much better introduction to Dr. Sam Geall than me. So, Konstantinos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Mazarakis. It's really a pleasure that we managed to get the third seminar organized at the Ecaterinii Lascaridis Foundation. So it is with great pleasure today that we have Dr. Sam Geall, who, as Mr. Mazarakis hinted, he actually wears many hats. That's what makes him such an important speaker about this subject. So he has roles in advocacy, policy research, and academia. So foremost, he's the CEO of China Dialogue. For those of you in Greece who don't know what that is, it's an independent non-profit organization, very active in the UK, but also internationally in promoting a common understanding of China's environmental challenges. So it's a very focused, a very committed organization. Dr. Geall is also an associate fellow at Chatham House, which, as you know, is the leading British think tank, and associate faculty at the University of Sussex. He has a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Manchester, and he edited the China Environment, the Green Revolution, published by Z Books in 2013, which is considered one of the key books on the field of China and the environment. His research focuses on climate and environmental politics in China and China's overseas impact through the Belt and Road Initiative. Perhaps this is something we can also discuss during Q&A. Now, also, Dr. Sam Geall actually attended COP26. He was in Glasgow so he can also give us his experience from the actual conference, right, which is a major event on its own. So, Dr. Geall, thank you very much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that warm introduction. That was really it's very kind, and it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you. I'm very sorry to not be in Athens to deliver this, and I hope to meet you there when it becomes easier to travel internationally, joining you from London today. I'll start by talking a bit about COP26, because I think that is interesting as a sort of way into thinking through my points this evening. I think I'll speak for about half an hour and try to cover something about sort of what COP26 tells us about where China and other nations kind of stand coming out of that talk, and where we need to get to, and what it tells us about kind of the progress of multilateralism in addressing climate change, what that then tells us about China's governmental kind of priorities and drivers in terms of what's driving it to move towards greater sort of climate action, and what some of the challenges that exist still are, and what some of the opportunities are, particularly for other nations in engaging with China and with Chinese investment and so on as we move forwards. I'll share a few slides. If I'm running over, do please just sort of jump in and tell me, because I want to make sure there's enough time for a proper Q&A. Let me just bring up my slides. You should be able to see those, right?
Yes, we are.
Great. So yeah, to start with COP26, just before we started, Kostas asked me what I thought of it, and I think that the way to sum it up is to say COP26 could have been so much worse. You know, China had a very diminished presence at COP26, but that didn't prove to be disastrous. China and India were sort of castigated for some last-ditch efforts to water down the text on coal, and that was sort of discouraging and very contested. There was internationally, particularly by rich nations, a real failure to demonstrate genuine solidarity when it came to what's called loss and damage, which is the sort of compensation efforts that we needed for things that can't be adapted to, and to go far enough on adaptation and climate finance. But the talks could have collapsed. They could have easily collapsed into a blame game, particularly between China and the United States. And instead, we saw the opposite in the form of some kind of faint hope that multilateral negotiations can see progress, even if not yet at a pace that really meets the urgency of the moment. There was at the end, for example, the Glasgow Climate Pact text that saw progress actually on the multilateral negotiations that we need to sort of move forward over the next few years towards the next COP. And there was a joint US-China announcement. That announcement wasn't ambitious or substantive enough, but it did illustrate that even in a context of rising geopolitical tension, it's possible to coordinate around the shared challenge of climate change, for contention and rivalry to exist without taking the planet hostage. It also put paid to claims that we've heard recently in Washington and increasingly China, that the Chinese government only engages in climate cooperation as a way to extract concessions on other areas, such as human rights. It showed actually that, you know, the United States seems to have stayed the course on its foreign policy towards China and other areas. You know, in many areas of foreign policy, the United States position is relatively unchanged since the Trump administration, but that where the two countries have recognized a common interest in working together to address the climate emergency, there can still be progress. In other words, cooperative and competitive dynamics can coexist around climate change. And in fact, I think we're seeing an uptick in some of those competitive dynamics around climate change, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. There was a lot of discussion throughout the talks, kind of particularly on the sidelines in some of the bigger announcements around the Green Belt and Road Initiative, the G7's purported alternative to that, the so-called Build Back Better World. The EU has now a proposed kind of alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative called the Global Gateway Initiative. India has proposed its own solar global grid, World One Sun One Grid. It could, you know, in way play out in the form of kind of a healthy competition over new infrastructure standards and the deployment of clean technology in the developing world, where, you know, new investment in energy and transportation infrastructure is urgently needed. And you could see, ideally, a race to the top in terms of different nations jockeying over who gets to build out the infrastructure and technology that will be needed for a carbon-constrained world. So what does this tell us about China's positioning? And, you know, since, as I've established, China didn't entirely snub the talks, as was, you know, one of the kind of media narratives that played out before. What did China sort of bring to COP26 and why? China's offer to the UN is described in its so-called NDC, its nationally determined contribution, which is to say its pledge to the UN talks. And this there wasn't a hugely updated version of that submitted immediately before the talks, and that formed part of the kind of media narrative immediately before, saying that China hadn't really increased its ambition. But the truth is that Xi Jinping had actually laid out China's position to the UN climate talks in two major speeches, both unilateral commitments given at the UN General Assembly in September 2020, and then a year later in September 2021. In September 2020, Xi used the stage at the UN General Assembly to lay out, at that point, a completely unexpected target, which was to move China towards carbon neutrality by 2060. That actually came as a surprise. It hadn't been trailed at all. It was a surprise even for Chinese environmental bureaucrats. And I think it's significant. Significant because in terms of its scale, it really means something in terms of global carbon budgets. The Global Climate Action Tracker Initiative that sort of tracks these things found that single pledge was actually the most significant single pledge that it's seen in terms of changing the trajectory of sort of global temperature targets, something like 0.3 degrees Celsius in terms of where we need to get to, just changed by that one announcement, given the scale of China's economy. And it's significant also in terms of the way that it then was fleshed out very quickly through the sort of policy-making frameworks that China then uses to operationalize this long-term target. We saw it, for example, reflected in China's new 14th five-year plan that came out in March of this year. That was a very carbon-centric plan. There was a lot of carbon intensity sort of work, for example, to reduce carbon intensity by 18% from 2020 levels over the 5 years. That means to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions per unit of economic output, and a corresponding target for energy intensity. It's a slightly different number, but it actually is commensurate with that carbon intensity target, as well as an uptick in non-fossil generation, which is to say mostly renewables generation plus nuclear. We've also seen it fleshed out through a subsequent strategy called the 1+N policy framework. That's essentially a way of then taking those overall 5-year targets and fleshing them out through the economy, through a set of kind of roadmaps, and actually through a set of plans that will then move back and actually retroactively start ramping up ambition in some of the energy and climate laws that already exist on the books in China, but are not necessarily yet aligned with those stricter targets implied by the 2060 target and the 15th five-year plan. So that includes working on energy structure, on power sector reform, on promoting green and low carbon technological innovation, green finance rules, and a number of other targets. So again, we've seen a kind of fleshing out. And in other words, this really sends a big market signal for industries in China, and it sends a policy signal across the Chinese economy to different sectors and to local authorities, provinces, cities, counties, and the like. Then a year later, we saw the other plank of China's big unilateral targets. I keep emphasizing the fact that this is unilateral because, of course, what it means for Xi to go to the UN and to make this announcement is he's pretty much tied this to his own personal political legacy. Rather than, for example, in 2014, when Xi Jinping and Barack Obama very memorably and importantly made a joint announcement bilaterally that actually laid a lot of the groundwork that allowed the Paris Agreement to be signed the following year in 2015. This is Xi kind of coming out alone and really tying his own political personal legacy in the Chinese context, sort of domestically as well, to these big international statements. And the BRI is an interesting one to really, for him to tie an announcement to, because it had become a major issue of political contention. If, for example, you look at President Biden's statements, when he was campaigning to be president in the United States during 2020, he made climate actually quite a big plank of his own campaigning. And when he was asked on the stump through the sort of campaign cycle, what are the major issues that you want to campaign on if you to campaign on if you're elected president on climate, he would consistently say three things. One is, if I'm elected president, I will rejoin the Paris Agreement, which of course he did. Two, I will get world leaders together within my first 100 days to increase ambition on climate ahead of COP26, which also he did with a big summit in April, to which Xi sent a video message. And three, I'm going to get serious with China about their overseas carbon dioxide emissions, particularly coal on the Belt and Road. Very consistently said that. And interestingly, here, of course, there's no admission that this was a sort of concession to the United States. Nevertheless, this is an example of Xi coming to the UN, unilaterally making a statement that did actually fit very much with where international pressure had kind of been placed. And I think, again, that's, it's interesting to note. So September 2021, Xi Jinping makes this statement. There's actually really two parts to it, even though it's very terse. One is that China will step up support for other developing countries in developing green and low carbon energy. And the other is that China will not build new coal-fired power plants abroad. And again, a lot of people said, well, that's not very substantive. He hasn't really laid out exactly what that looks like. But I think on the basis of actually how quickly we saw an implementation of that earlier pledge on 2060, we can kind of believe actually that this will see progress and we'll see some implementation through the policymaking infrastructure. And to be honest, there's no reason to think that they won't, because actually the economics are really pointing this way. This makes a lot of sense. There hasn't been a great deal of new finance for coal overseas in any case. Japan and South Korea had made similar commitments not long before, who were the other, two of the other main remaining kind of overseas financiers of coal. I do think this will send a significant message, and again, a kind of market signal of where China's finance is moving and where Chinese construction and other sorts of investment and operations are starting to move. And this is pretty consistent with where the Belt and Road Initiative was moving. You can see for the first years, we are now seeing a decline already in the share of investment that is moving from the big Chinese so-called policy banks, China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank that move a lot of that big sort of state finance overseas. It is now increasingly moving in the last few years towards solar and nuclear and hydropower and so on, away from coal for the first time. It's still until recently quite dominated by fossil fuels, but I do think we'll see that shift starting to take place. So again, sort of why and what might be driving China to sort of take this stance? As I mentioned, there was a clear kind of international and bilateral character to international cooperation on climate change earlier. The Paris Agreement, I think, was made possible to a large extent by this unprecedented cooperation that Xi and Barack Obama established in 2014 to work together on climate change and to kind of hold each other's feet to the fire. And yet when Trump was elected, of course, that sort of went out the window. Trump, withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement and essentially destroyed that sort of framework for collaboration between the US and China that had underpinned that agreement. So why then, in 2017, did we see Xi at both big domestic Communist Party meetings and in international meetings really doubling down on China's commitment to the Paris Agreement? What does that what does that really reflect? What I'd like to, you to sort of take away, if you take away sort of two things from this, from my sort of brief remarks. The first would be that this for China is largely about national self-interest. There is a strong understanding at sort of an elite political level in China that there are good reasons for China to move ahead on climate change, quite aside from any kind of international cooperation. And regardless actually of really what happens at the UN, what happens at COP26 and so on, there's a strong understanding at a high level that it's in China's interest to act on climate change. And this, I think, stems from multiple understandings, partly environmental and climate change related, but also there are strong political economic drivers, quite aside from anything altruistic or anything environmental, that mean that it's in China's self-interest to embed kind of climate action within sort of top-down political drivers or within top-down sort of policy. And I'll lay out what those are. Note I said there are two things I want you to take away. I'll come to what the second is in a moment. But so, why would China move itself to what Xi Jinping called in 2017 the driver's seat on climate cooperation? Firstly, I think there is an understanding at an elite level, and there has been for at least 15 years, that China is uniquely vulnerable to climate change. It has a very large, very exposed eastern seaboard. And decades of very rapid export-oriented growth means that there's been very heavy urbanization in that eastern seaboard. And that eastern seaboard is built up in low coastal elevation zones. And these are very exposed to things like storm surges, to saline intrusion, sea level rise, all of the things that are likely to bite much more in a world that is more characterized by warming. So this is actually an old map. This is from 2000, but the population density isn't has only sort of continued to increase in those low coastal elevation, low elevation coastal zones along the east. Also, of course, northern China has faced water scarcity and drought as a chronic condition for as long as it can remember, and southern China has faced flooding again for sort of as long as can be remembered, and both of those have worsened and become more uncertain in the context of climate change. In summer 2020, you saw really devastating floods, and again in summer 2021, we saw really terrible kind of flooding in southern China. We've seen bad droughts as well the last couple of years. All of those conditions are likely to worsen with climate change, and there's a strong understanding of how that intersects with energy systems, given hydropower, and even worse, food systems. And that's a key issue for political legitimacy for the Communist Party, is that they need to focus on food security if they want to think about their own kind of party legitimacy. But there are other reasons, other political economic reasons to think about moving on decarbonization and climate change, quite aside from anything altruistic. And a key issue for Chinese policymakers, again, for a very long time, since at least the mid-90s, has been diversifying away from fossil fuel imports. China's very struck by the fact that it relies on a single choke point for much of its energy imports in the Strait of Malacca. This, of course, is patrolled by the US Navy 7th Fleet. It's seen as a key vulnerability for China in the event of war. And it's something that's driven a lot of Belt and Road policymaking as well, is to think about how to build new pipelines, how to build new routes to secure energy supplies aside from that single choke point. Well, another good way to ensure energy security, of course, is to move away from fossil fuels with all of their geopolitical entanglements and with the volatility of pricing that comes with being, reliant on oil. If you can manufacture energy security effectively through expanding renewable energy, you've really improved and helped to diversify away from fossil fuels. And I think that's one big driver and one big kind of upside or co-benefit of moving towards an increasingly fossil fuel oriented economy. Alongside that, there are kind of almost inherent technological economic dynamics and forces that you can unleash once you start investing in renewables. And China has really unleashed those. For the last 15 years or so, there's been enormous state investment in renewables, particularly solar and wind. And that industry has really played out a classic kind of learning curve effect and scale of production effect, which has brought down the price enormously globally. And so, when I talk about the things that made Paris possible, I'd say really there were two things that made Paris possible. One was that unprecedented agreement between Xi Jinping and Barack Obama. The other was actually a shift in the real economy. And that, was the cost of renewables falling drastically in those few years before Paris. And a large driver of that was the scale of production in China and the competition between large Chinese firms that kept driving down that price. China's been able to benefit from that. It's also, of course, been able to position itself as a technology leader. And this is a big part, I think, of the driver of the kind of political drivers for China, is positioning itself as a leading exporter of the technologies that will be needed for a carbon-constrained world. And I think China sees a huge benefit in that, particularly in terms of moving up the value chain away from energy-intensive, polluting, low-cost manufacturing towards being an innovator, and seeing with that a sort of slower, higher quality growth, rather than the very fast kind of breakneck growth that characterized the first 20, 30 years of China's sort of reform era, moving towards a slower form of growth that sees some reform towards greater sort of innovation and a more kind of diversified economy. This is something that fits very much with where sort of policymakers want to see the Chinese economy move. And as a result, we've seen it, there's been a long-term focus on developing these sort of strategic niches, particularly around electric vehicles and renewables and so on, in successive 5-year plans until now. And so we've seen sort of the fruits of that really being born in the low carbon economy. Alongside that, of course, this is about, as I mentioned, party legitimacy, not only in terms of averting the effects of climate change that could damage growth, but also in terms of being seen to act on an issue of increasing public concern. Pollution, particularly air pollution, but also soil and water pollution, all of which are connected to China's reliance on coal, as well as other sort of very polluting industries, is an issue of public concern. And being seen to act on that is important for the party. Of course, China's politics aren't democratic, but there still is politics, and that still does hinge on these kinds of issues of public legitimacy. And clearly, this is something that I think the elements of the party, at least, care about to a large extent. Now, all of this, as I've mentioned, sort of has been tied up to an extent with a rhetorical effort to tie Xi's legacy to something called ecological civilization. This is a sort of a discourse or a term that's or a buzzword that has circulated in China since at least 2007. So it predates Xi's rise to power in 2013, but it's something that Xi kind of really capitalized on and made a big part of his own political kind of agenda and his own political legacy. And I also think this is significant for Xi, not only in terms of his own domestic political legacy, but in terms of something which Chinese sort of theorists and sort of political scholars describe as discourse power, or China's right to speak. Now, this is really a concept that China sees its own effort to be recognized internationally and to speak on the world stage and at the UN as also contributing to kind of the language of the sort of international community, by which I mean China wants to see its own concepts exported globally. And we've seen that, you know, in other aspects as well. Sort of for example, China has tried very hard to have its concept of the Belt and Road Initiative or some of its own concepts around multilateralism and so on sort of exported. And one of the more successful ones has been ecological civilization. And we've seen that, for example, in China's hosting of the UN Biodiversity Conference. Now, China is hosting the UN Biodiversity Conference for the first time. It's one of the first sort of major global multilateral conventions that China has been able to host. It didn't take place in 2020 as was originally planned because of COVID. It was postponed to this year. The opening of that took place this year in Kunming, although it was largely virtual and online. And the second half of it, which hopefully will be in person and actually negotiated, will be in Kunming in spring next year. This actually is it's an equivalent of kind of Paris or another similar sort of treaty making multilateral conference, in that it will actually sign off the next 10 years of the global biodiversity framework. So it's actually a very significant one and quite a big effort for China to kind of step up on this. And what of course is significant for China in this regard is that it actually sees the words ecological civilization in a UN conference for the first time. The actual title of the whole event is Ecological Civilization, Building a Shared Future for All Life on Earth, all of which is an echo of various kind of Xi Jinping signature buzzwords. So for better or worse, this sees sort of China really managing to export some of these concepts for the first time. So I think all of this sort of comes together to explain really why there would be a strong kind of top-down push for China to really act on the environment, even kind of aside from international cooperation, and why, therefore, even in a context where global tensions are rising, where US-China tension and so on is increasing, China would still continue to sort of stay the course on climate change, and why this wasn't necessarily derailed by those kind of increasing tensions in other areas. Now, I'm going to wrap up soon, but I do want to make one more kind of key point. I mentioned that if there were sort of two things I wanted you to come away with. The first one was that China is motivated largely by kind of national self-interest to work on these issues. The other, though, that I do want you to kind of come away with is that China's governance is not, however, smoothly technocratic and top-down. While there is, of course, a strong top-down element, and you know, she's efforts to consolidate power within the party are fairly unprecedented, you know, in the modern era, and he does actually have a lot more power within his own party than his predecessor. Nevertheless, actually watching the implementation of policy in China is still best described as something called fragmented authoritarianism. That means that, you know, at an elite level, there is still protracted bargaining between elite groups in China that actually waters down the effective implementation of a lot of laws, and also that there is a fragmentation between central and local. That means that, you know, efforts to promulgate a particular law or campaign or effort from the center to the local often get watered down by actually a very strong degree of devolution to the center that actually has been responsible for a lot of the growth in China. You know, the way that China really unleashed growth in the reform era since the 1980s was actually by allowing the provinces to have a very strong role in boosting their own growth efforts, often through quite collusive relationships with industry. And that's created very strong networks that are actually very difficult to break up if you're trying to get a handle on, for example, emissions. In practice, this has meant when you study, so the slide I put up is from a study I did of a policy called Solar Energy for Poverty Alleviation Policy. I'm not going to go into any detail about that, other than to say, looking at this policy, which is a very progressive and interesting initiative to essentially roll out solar energy in a way that would benefit local communities, allowing them to gain extra income by selling electricity back to the grid for poverty alleviation, at the same time as basically dealing with a overproduction of solar panels that weren't being sort of installed at the local level. I found that essentially the fragmentation of this meant that it wasn't benefiting local communities. It was benefiting various kind of industry efforts much more than it was benefiting the local poverty alleviation efforts, essentially due to capture by different industries at different points along the route. And that's pretty sort of classic when it comes to the implementation of local policy in China, which is to say vested interests still matter. And that is a lot of the way that we can also explain the continued reliance on coal, despite the fact that there are these very strong sort of efforts from the center and from the top. And so we will continue to see, and you should expect to see, a kind of push and pull in China between these kind of top-down policy efforts that I think are actually quite genuine to try to deal with the problem and to move China away from a kind of dependence on coal-fired power for a lot of its energy generation. And this occasionally, for example, local provinces just moving ahead and installing a whole bunch of new coal-fired power. And then sometimes you'll see the center kind of come and swoop in. Now, all of that, I think, continues, and that's the major challenge, but there will be opportunities. And I think that the major kind of opportunity that China is now facing is in that second part of Xi Jinping's promise to the UN in September 2021. As I mentioned, he said two things. One is that China is going to stop building coal overseas on the Belt and Road, and I think actually that will play out. I don't think state-owned enterprises, and I doubt private enterprises either, to be honest, will be building new coal-fired power plants overseas. Maybe some of the existing plants might go ahead. We'll have to see how this plays out. I think it will be difficult for them to get financed at this point. But there's another part to what he said, which was that China will try to support green energy on the Belt and Road. And as I mentioned, I think this offers a real opportunity for healthy competition between China, between other rich nations and multilateral banks and others in building out the infrastructure that will be sorely needed, particularly after the pandemic, in regenerating and in refinancing growth in a lot of countries that have faced really terrible kind of downturns and in some cases fiscal crises and debt crises and so on in the wake of COVID-19. And there is enormous investment need for renewable energy. Even if you just take on face value those pledges to the Belt and Road Initiative, those pledges to Paris that were given by Belt and Road Initiative countries in their so-called NDCs, their pledges to Paris on renewable technology. There's some $500 billion, I think $500 billion, just so $500 billion implied by those pledges needed for renewable energy technology. So enormous kind of need immediately. And what this signals, I think, is that China is sort of ready to step in and be part of that competition, and what I hope will be a kind of race to the top. So I think this actually offers an enormous opportunity for China to export the experience it has of building out its own renewable energy economy, which has been kind of a really kind of enormous example of what is described often in the literature, in the discussion about China as under-promising and over-delivering, particularly when it comes to renewable energy. China really has exceeded expectations, partly just because of the economic and kind of technological forces that it unleashed through developing that industry and that sort of strategic niche. And I think the experience of that is something that China should attempt to export, and also that countries receiving recipient countries of investment should be looking to capitalize on, rather than on traditional conventional forms of investment, which historically have favored high carbon types of sort of generation and industry. So I will stop there and hope that we can have a sort of fruitful discussion in the comments. I hope it was in the question and answer. I hope that was useful. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sam. No, I have to say, you're an incredible speaker because you stick to the point and you also respect the time frame, which makes the life of a chair very easy. So I know there are a couple of questions from the audience. So let's start with those, and then I have a few questions prepared for you as well. I think Mr. Heretis has a question.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sam, I have a simple question, but I believe very complicated to be answered. So I'll just say it as it comes into my mind, and I hope you give me an answer that is a good one. Do you see any hard tensions on the energy market regarding China, Europe, USA, Russia, and the big players that may create a serious war conflict? Thank you.
So what's the question? Will there be tension around energy that would create conflict?
Yes. The tension is the new coming market of distributing energy among the big players of energy in the world.
I see.
Do you feel or do you sense, can you forecast that there might be a great chance that can create a huge war, I mean, a major conflict?
No, so I think my sense is that yes, there'll be increasing tension and contention around things, for example, like so-called carbon border adjustment mechanisms, right? The EU wants to introduce a border carbon tax that prevents carbon leakage, so-called, and China is opposed to that because it sees it as a protectionist measure. The US is talking about something similar. I don't think the US has any chance of ever passing legislation that would make that possible, though. So I don't really see the US implementing something like that. China has itself its own carbon market, which it's been sort of slowly rolling out. It now has a national carbon market covering its power sector. It's not really trading at real prices yet, whereas the EU market seems to be kind of actually really ramping up. Its prices are rallying. So there's there is a chance that China would be disadvantaged by the introduction of the EU carbon border tax. But I don't see this leading to such great conflict because, as I mentioned, I actually think China ultimately is quite serious about its own sort of decarbonization efforts. And in the end, what I see more likely happening is some coexistence of both cooperative and competitive dynamics, and that competitive dynamics around climate can lead to a kind of race to the top. I think China actually really wants to be the leading exporter of low carbon technologies, and will compete with Europe and with the United States in these areas, and that this doesn't necessarily this might lead to trade competition, and that's something I'd welcome. I mean, I think that type of competition, as opposed to protectionism, is actually basically a win-win if it plays out. If it plays out in a way that isn't excessively protectionist. When I'm speaking to, say, audiences of European or US policymakers, and there's talk about sort of how we need to compete with China and so on, and there's often sort of comments about that. So I'll say, great, compete with China, invest in your own infrastructure right now, and in your manufacturing infrastructure, and in your R&D and so on, so that you can compete with China. I think that's great. It's very I think that type of competition is to be welcomed. I don't think protectionism is necessarily the same thing, and arguably China also has a very protectionist attitude when it comes to elements of its economy. But no, I don't see it devolving into conflict, honestly. I think there are other areas where we see, obviously, outside of climate change, where we see increasing risk of conflict between China and the United States and so on. Clearly, there's very high tensions over Taiwan and Hong Kong and other areas. Interestingly, though, I think climate has proven to be an area where China and the United States have managed to carve out some space where they can actually work cooperatively on an area of shared planetary survival. And I think that's really positive. I honestly think that we need to establish climate change as something that can survive as an area for coordination, even in or particularly in areas of when tensions are rising in other areas, because it's an area of genuine common interest, despite incommensurate kind of value conflicts in other areas. And I think that's actually a really important kind of principle of international politics that we need to maintain.
Thank you.
Great. So Sam, if I may jump in, I mean, you clearly offered a rather optimistic view of what might follow. And so let me bring a less optimistic perspective. You touched upon China's internal political configuration, right? And of course, the People's Republic is not a monolith, which means that top-down implementation doesn't really depend on Beijing. And we have seen that in many policy fields. Now, when it comes to environment, there has been a clash of incentives, of structural incentives between growth and environmental protection. So my question is, do you see that the structure of incentives in which local governments operate, do you see a substantial change? Because with, climate change is one thing that China is facing, the other is slowing growth. So do you see that there is a green solution to both problems, or is there still a major clash going on that might undermine China's commitments?
It's the key question. I think that's absolutely the right question to ask, and that is the thing that's going to determine it. And yeah, to answer your question, yes, you're totally right that it's that kind of structural misalignment of incentives that has undermined efforts in the past. Not only, as I mentioned, is there kind of regulatory capture at the local level, where there's often a collusive relationship between the local government and industry. Polluters often will essentially kind of pull the strings when it comes to budgetary decisions, fiscal decisions that are made at a local level. That will often then affect, for example, the effectiveness of any kind of regulatory infrastructure at the local level. Even the staffing of environmental protection bureaus often was sort of defined by the local government, which in turn was reliant on local industry. And at the same time, there was this issue about actually what kinds of incentives do officials care about in terms of their own promotion. So, there's something called the Cadre Responsibility System, which is essentially the key performance indicators that local officials think about when they're thinking about their own political careers. And historically, the one that really mattered was growth. It was GDP growth. If you can get a sufficient kind of bump in GDP growth during your tenure as party official in X city or county, then you can ensure your promotion to the next level. And it used to be that really that was the only thing that mattered. And the promise of the kind of so-called ecological civilization agenda was that they would start to shift those incentives so that they would be more balanced between growth on the one hand, and then also, for example, improvement in living standards, or that it would be balanced off against things like natural resources depletion or environmental violations. I think there has been progress on that agenda. I do actually think that some of that reform is real. For example, it used to be that if you committed an environmental violation in your tenure and then you were promoted, your environmental violation was wiped from your record, and that you would have this sort of clean slate the next in your promotion. So you could do anything you wanted, really, as long as it produced growth during your tenure, get promoted, and then just keep doing the same thing again. And now that rule has gone. So it actually stays on your record throughout your tenure as an official, which matters. It incentivizes people to avoid committing those kinds of violations. And interestingly, those violations are much more likely to be turned up because there is now much more effort put into top-down inspection of local authorities through the party now, as opposed to through regulatory apparatus. So the essentially the same disciplinary efforts that have been used through the anti-corruption campaign are now being used particularly to look at air pollution emissions sort of efforts, and are being applied quite stringently and in quite a fearsome way, actually. You know, since the 2060 target was created in September 2020, there's a new party effort chaired by the Vice Premier Han Zheng, which then can implement through the party disciplinary infrastructure. So there are these kind of top-down inspection squads, basically, that will come down and check people's kind of emissions progress at the local level. Now, in terms of actually the kinds of structural reform efforts I think would long-term be more effective, I do think there are better ways of doing it than just the top-down inspections-oriented method, which is a kind of whack-a-mole approach, right, where you just swoop down and start, you know, exposing local officials for corruption or for not adequately disclosing information, or for faking their emission statistics and these kinds of things. That matters. I do think it's actually quite, you know, it has some effectiveness. I think more effective would be just greater transparency, empowering local authorities, empowering local civil society, empowering local media to do that job. And in past eras of governance, that's really been the case. You know, when I first started kind of working on environmental politics in China around the sort of mid-2000s, so say around 2006, 2007, a lot of the big efforts to reform environmental governance were really geared towards actually using greater transparency and greater civil society kind of mobilization, essentially mobilizing social forces to help deal with these structural misalignments. And this is a very different approach. This is a much more kind of eco-authoritarian approach, I would say. But I'd say it's real. You know, it is actually biting to some extent. Maybe, you know, maybe it's not going as far as it could, but I think there is something happening. Finally, there still is, I think, a question about how you balance the speed of decarbonization with the likely effect on employment and inflation, and how that's how the party kind of views that. And if you look at the rhetoric coming out of the Politburo in the last sort of few months, there's been a lot of talk about avoiding something called irrational decarbonization, or so-called campaign-style decarbonization. And there's a lot of slogans around, you know, we don't to before we build. In other words, don't dismantle every coal plant and end up with a situation where there are power blackouts or inflation due to a supply crunch before we built out the renewable energy infrastructure to sort of replace coal. And again, you know, they're not wrong actually about that. That is a genuine concern, I think, if you're building out a new infrastructure, is that you do need to phase it down in a way that's sort of vaguely rational in terms of not immediately producing counter incentives or price spikes or mass unemployment. I think it's a real issue for any country creating, you know, a so-called just transition. And I think that is going to be a real problem for, you know, a real challenge for China. And as you say, it's not smoothly technocratic either. So in that process, they're going to have to deal with a number of different lobbies. And those aren't just the coal industry and the vested interests and so on. That's also workers who are going to need, you know, re-employment and you know, lots of other people. So it's going to be a complex issue, and it's going to play out in lots of different ways. And this will be, you know, a major topic for politics in China over the next decade.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite questions from the audience. You can.
I would like to ask something. I have heard the view held by some important commentators here in Greece, that in ancient times, sea power used to be the major apple of discord. This changed after the in more modern times in energy. That energy is the factor that is important for controlling the world. And this is now moving towards high technology microchips that will replace both of these older issues in how important it is for the future. So today I understand that your view is that China is possibly using this drive towards high technology in the area also of moving towards green energy and taking the lead. Is this a right approach, a correct approach?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that in the longer sort of scale and in the wider view, we're seeing the transition from molecules to electrons in terms of the basis of the economy, right? So from oil to electrification. And the implications of that 2060 goal are by mid-century, China's economy will be completely electrified. And that means a lot. It's sort of technologically, it's a huge, it's an absolutely massive kind of transition. It will spur the next wave of growth. And I think China sees it itself, positioning itself to be the primary kind of financiers and innovators and installers of these technologies. And one of the major things they're already building out, for example, globally, and isn't really discussed as much as maybe it should be, is ultra high voltage transmission lines. China's state grid, the state monopoly that builds out China's electric lines, is building those across the globe. And that's one of the major things it's sort of exporting. And it sees itself really as being the kind of the new installer of the electrification that will drive growth sort of globally and will transform growth from being fossil fuel based to being largely renewable energy based. And as you say, it's not, moving towards electrification isn't just about decarbonization, it's also about digitization. And we're talking about smart grids that are increasingly kind of dematerialized and digitized and work with an entirely new economy, much more entirely transformed and much more digitized and sort of microchip based economy. And China clearly sees itself, wanting to be a leader in that. I mean, those technological revolutions globally have always been driven by large-scale public investment, right? Including in the United States. The sort of historians of technology will tell you that the kind of stories that people say about this playing out through great innovation and free market, or through companies and free markets and so on, really ignore how long-term patient investment by governments tends to underpin that innovation. And China understands that to a large extent. And so you have things like the medium long-term framework for technology innovation in China that's been around since, I think, the mid-90s, which has been, to their credit, putting a lot of public investment into some of these long-term technological challenges, big ones being electrification, the electric car, solar energy, wind energy, and some of the kind of other technologies that slightly further out, green hydrogen, fusion, nuclear fission. They really see themselves as trying to be kind of on the leading edge of this. Obviously other countries also have that type of, the US still to a large extent does have that type of long-term investment framework in areas like DARPA and so on. So there will be a competition over these sorts of technologies. And there's always a gap between that long-term advanced research and actually getting it to the stage of kind of commercialization, and China faces that problem as well. Most of the stuff they commercialize is fairly low cost. The solar panels, for example, that they've commercialized have been the kind of lower end of the market historically. But yeah, I sort of think that they're right in really prioritizing these long-term technological challenges, because history sort of shows us that does play out effectively. The other anecdote I think that's sort of relevant and interesting is the way that China really dominated its the renewable energy industry was this sort of strange, there was a sort of dialectical play where a private enterprise actually really started moving into manufacturing solar panels for export markets. And in the 90s and early 2000s, it was all Chinese private firms who identified solar energy, found a sort of a low-cost niche for that, and almost every panel was going to markets in Germany, in Europe, across Europe, the United States, and so on. After the financial crisis in 2008 and a sort of change of policy in the EU, and also anti-dumping measures that were forced on China, much to China's sort of annoyance, being accused of kind of state aid or whatever for those industries, China needed to create a domestic market. So it created a whole set of new policy drivers to encourage the creation of a domestic market to soak up that oversupply. And that in turn created a whole new, well, not only did it create a market, but it created a whole new kind of wave of innovation and investment, and really transformed China's economy, and actually led then to the kind of state stepping in and really harnessing some of that enterprise. So you get this interesting kind of interplay between both private and state, user-driven and kind of top-down, and kind of the long-term public investment, and actually sort of private enterprise. So it's also a little bit more innovative than just being a kind of a long-term sort of top-down view, and it involves global supply chains, of course, as well.
Okay, are there any questions from the audience? Okay, I have one more question about the whole idea of greening the BRI. Well, I have to say, although decarbonization, and basically, to be concrete, not building new coal plants is a positive development. However, greening the BRI will depend on other things as well. So Chinese SOEs do not have a great record when it comes to things like environmental impact assessments, and they actually do contribute to a race to the bottom when it comes to implementing and existing environmental regulations. And I have seen that, especially in the Balkans, as you know, where the availability of Chinese financing slows down decarbonization. Mm. So, yeah, I just want your thoughts on the different aspects involved in greening the BRI, and whether you think this is something that will actually have an impact, or it's just another slogan intended for an international audience.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So, we've mentioned that politics in China isn't very monolithic, or isn't as monolithic as it might appear from outside, and it's not as smoothly technocratic and top down as it might appear from outside. And the Belt and Road is even more so. I think it's very nebulous. There isn't a single master plan that you can use to describe the Belt and Road. That there isn't a single kind of policy-making body. If it's anything, it's really just an overcapacity of in China, and the creation of a kind of escape valve for that overcapacity. So basically, that capital needs to go somewhere. That oversupply of everything, of materials, and of essentially you need new markets when you're when you're sort of saturated domestically, you need to create new markets overseas, and that's what the Belt and Road Initiative is. It's a kind of a way of creating new trade and connectivity kind of initiatives in order to try to find places for that new investment. So it's quite as a result, it's quite sort of multifarious. It can mean all kinds of different things in different places, and actually often is governed by various other bilateral agreements and regional agreements and everything else. And alongside that, there's been a kind of a flurry of policy making around the so-called green BRI. And there's actually now, I don't know, 15, 20 different kind of documents from different policymaking bodies in China at different levels, ministries, party bodies, trade associations, that talk about new rules they want to bring in that will green the BRI, but none of them have the force of law, partly because China doesn't really know how it regulates its enterprises overseas, because it doesn't really have a very clear kind of framework for doing that. And where the one place where they really could change things is, as you mentioned, the finance and the China Development Bank and China Exim Bank and so on. And they've been quite slow to really move on this. They don't necessarily have the signal yet that they need to really change the way they do things. If you talk to them, they'll say that's because we're not getting, because we're demand responsive. We supply, and we listen to our borrowers, and they tell us what they want. If they want to invest in a coal plant, that's their problem. We just lend. Now that's clearly there's two sides to this. I mean, they're not wrong to a certain extent. I mean, there's an extent to which I do think recipient countries need to get smarter about what they invest in. It's a terrible long-term investment to build a coal plant, because it's not cheap when you think about the falling cost of renewable energy. It's not cheap when you think about the internalized costs, externalized costs of air pollution and labor and everything else that suffers when you invest in a coal plant. And it's certainly not cheap when you think about what's going to happen with carbon pricing in the future as the Paris Agreement and everything else starts to bite. But also, of course, it's incumbent on the Chinese regulators and so on to do better. And the hope is that this signal from Xi Jinping actually starts to mean something. And I'm sort of hopeful that it does, actually, on coal at least. I do think that it's going to be very difficult for Chinese banks to justify financing any coal overseas at this point. And we've seen it already with Chinese private banks. So I think China Development Bank and so on just simply can't. I think they're too much a state entity that they just won't be able to finance coal anymore. But even, say, Bank of China, which isn't theoretically controlled by doesn't theoretically have to follow this rule, has now said that it's not financing coal overseas. So I think we'll see Chinese finance quite quickly sort of fall into line on that, which will be positive. And hopefully what it starts to open up is a bigger conversation about what you finance instead. And that's where that other part of it comes in is okay, well, if they're going to actually make, you're right, if you want to make greening a big part of this, you need to go further than not just financing coal, but also you need to think about cement and steel and aluminium and all of these other heavy industries which China is at the moment exporting. It's going to be that I think it's genuinely going to be interesting, and but I think the fact that Xi has kind of made this again like a plank of his international of his personal kind of policy legacy, both domestically and on the international stage, it should matter to the extent that this is now something that sort of international civil society, that that other sort of global South partners do have something to sort of hang their criticism on when they come to a forum or whatever with Xi to say, hey, didn't you promise that you're greening the Belt and Road? Didn't you make this promise on not funding coal? Hopefully that starts to mean something. And hopefully also this sort of race to the top starts playing out in terms of other countries saying, you know, the G7 saying, well, we're doing the Build Back Better world, and this is all going to finance a new generation of renewable energy infrastructure initiatives. All of this stuff, I hope, leads to a kind of race to the top. But like you say, yeah, it's tricky. I do think that this is one area where there's going to need to be a lot more scrutiny, where I hope civil society in recipient countries will be much tougher on their own governments as well, in saying, look, you know, Chinese finance doesn't have to, you know, there's Chinese finance. That doesn't need to go into a coal plant. The Chinese will finance a solar plant as well. You can make a different offer to your, you can make a different, you know, you can still get international finance. You can still get finance from the China Development Bank, whatever. It doesn't have to go into cement and steel. It could go into building the next generation of, you know, manufacturing solar or whatever. That's, I think, you know, there's various arguments that will need to be made at different levels.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Do we have other questions from the audience? If not, I think we can wrap up with this more positive and optimistic note. So thank you very much, Mr. Mazarakis, for organizing today's seminar into the foundation. Thank you. Many thanks to all of you for attending and for your questions and interest. And of course, big thanks to our speaker, Dr. Geall, for his insightful presentation and really to the point comments and answers to our questions.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Good night from Athens then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.